President Trump's trip to Asia, meeting with Xi Jinping, APEC, new Japanese prime minister, and of course, a second meeting with the president of the Republic of Korea. All that and more next on the Capital Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in Washington, D.C. Good evening to those of you in the Republic of Korea. Good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 124th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capital Cable, President Trump's trip to Asia, which included a number of important meetings, conferences, ministerials, whatever you want to call it. It was undertaken. People were participating, they were dialoguing, all of that good stuff. And with us, an all-star cast to unpack this. Let me introduce them formally one by one. We have first up, Dr. Evan Medeiros. His bio is online. Look it up. But let me just say, I'll hit some of the highlights there. Professor at Georgetown, former NSC Senior Director for Asia under President Obama. And of course, RAND, where I think I first met Evan Sunning in Santa Monica, California. Evan, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
All right, outstanding. And next up, Chris Johnstone. Everybody knows Chris. Chris is in and around the orbit at CSIS, as they say. Everybody knows him from his government service, of course, which included the OSD time, where he's a top policy person doing East Asia. He worked at the NSC, of course, in the intelligence community. And as I mentioned, CSIS, and now a partner over at the Asia Group, where he leads the defense practice. Chris, welcome to the show.
Great to be here with you, Mark, and with friends. Thanks.
All right, excellent. Is Evan a friend or kind of, I don't know.
On the end. We'll go with that for this second.
Oh, friend of me. Okay, excellent. And I don't know if Victor's here. Victor, are you here yet?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. All right. Just-in-time supply chain that is the CSIS Capital Cable produced. Georgetown University professor Victor Cha, head of the geopolitics cone at CSIS, obviously former Bush NSC, Defense Policy Board under Biden, and I would say less cantankerous these days because interesting flickers of life from the New York Giants. Victor, welcome back to the show.
That's right. We have a quarterback. We know we have a quarterback.
All right. Outstanding. All right. Let's get into it. Evan, I'm going to come to you first. And why don't you and I talked a little bit off screen, and I think framing this up in terms of the president's trip to Asia, can you walk us through broad strokes what happened, important meetings, and then obviously we want to dig deep on the President Xi Jinping meeting. And again, welcome to the show, Evan.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Victor. Great to be here. So as unconventional as Trump is, and as idiosyncratic as he is, what's so interesting to me was how conventional this trip to Asia was. It began in Malaysia, then it moved to Japan and ended in South Korea. The bookends were first the East Asia Summit hosted by the Malaysians, and then APEC hosted by the South Koreans. In Malaysia, he signed 2 trade agreements, one with Malaysia, one with Cambodia, released joint statements with Vietnam and Thailand. In other words, joint statements that eventually will be more fleshed out trade agreements, had a series of bilateral meetings, including with Prime Minister Anwar of Malaysia, moves to Japan, meets the new Japanese Prime Minister. I don't want to steal Chris's thunder. And then, of course, the showstopper is going to South Korea, seeing the President Lee for the second time in South Korea, while I don't think he attended the leaders portion of the APEC meeting, he was sort of, let's say, in the broader APEC ecosystem, and importantly met with Xi Jinping. So that's actually a pretty conventional trip. I think it's a pretty successful trip. And for Asia hands that were concerned about a diminished American attention and involvement in Asia, I think this trip answers that question. Over to you, Mark.
All right, outstanding. And Evan, quickly, before we pivot to the Xi Jinping question, why do you think it was successful?
Well, first of all, showing up is, 80–90% of the equation in East Asia. Secondly, that he was able to continue to make progress on both his agenda and an American agenda that's important to him. So, the trade deals with Malaysia and Cambodia, being able to, meeting the new Japanese prime minister literally within weeks of her taking over, right, is an incredibly reassuring signal, especially for the first female prime minister. Think about the alternative. If he had gone to just Malaysia and South Korea and hadn't actually stopped in Japan and met the new Japanese prime minister, it would have led to a swirl of questions. Fleshing out the details of the $350 billion commitment for South Korea to invest in the United States. And then, of course, meeting Xi Jinping is such a big piece of business because whether you like it or not, the U.S.-China relationship is a prime mover of regional order in the Asia-Pacific.
All right, outstanding. So what I'm hearing out of you, which is interesting, and it dovetails with your opening comments, more traditional leader-level diplomacy, right? The engagement matters with some important deliverables that I'm sure we'll get into.
And attending, to some extent, the multilateral meetings, both EAS and APEC as bookmarks. The one criticism I will make is that Trump's diplomacy in Asia is very leader-level focused and very economics focused, which leans into the instincts and preferences of Asian leaders. What we didn't hear a lot about were security issues. And it's important to keep in mind that the American strategy toward Asia has always been a hybrid strategy, right? While the Washington conversation at CSIS and other institutions largely focuses on alliances, and of course, those are a cornerstone of U.S. strategy, it's always been a hybrid strategy of security alliances mixed with political and economic bargains. In other words, going back to the 1950s, it wasn't just the U.S., Japan, U.S., South Korea, alliance. It was the fact that America was so tied to the growth strategies and the prosperities of Asian nations that they could continue to get access to the American market, American capital, American technology. And to the extent that that hybrid strategy is sustained, the U.S. will remain a centerpiece of regional dynamics in the region. To the extent that it's not, China sees an opening. And I will end on this point. It's notable that in recent weeks, the Singaporean prime minister has been very public in sort of talking about the rapid diminishing role of the United States in Asia, that Asia is shifting from a unipolar American system to a unipolar Chinese system. I disagree with that position, but nonetheless, there are countries in the region that see Trump's approach, MAGA approach, America first, whatever you want to call it, as one that's leading to a reduced U.S. role. And I think to some degree, this visit answers that question.
All right, outstanding, Evan. Now, I said I was going to come to you about the Xi Trump summit. Let's bookmark that for a second. I'm going to come back to that in round two because you teased out some really interesting threads on broad brushstrokes on the trip. Let me just get everybody's views on that. And so let me come to Chris. Chris, I think I talked to you yesterday and I teed you up to talk all about Japan, but now I'm going to say, I'm going to call an audible. I want your views on these broader brushstrokes of the trip, if you don't mind. With, obviously a particular lens towards the Japanese portion, because that's where the heart of your expertise it lies. But Chris, your comments.
Yeah, sure, Mark. And I endorse very strongly much of what Evan said. I think the other piece to this that made the trip successful is that it's quite clear that our Asian friends have learned a lot about how to construct a successful environment for a visit, right? When I look at the visit to Japan, for example, the trappings were perfect, right? They light up Tokyo Tower in red, white, and blue. Prime Minister Takaichi assumes the mantle of Abe. She gives him Abe's golf putter and a signed golf bag. I think a similar dynamic was on display in Korea with the presentation of this crown. In other words, really sort of constructing an environment that welcomes Trump and appeals to the things that Trump considers to be important. So I think that's a key piece of the success here. Optically, it worked. I think I very much agree with Evan's point about the emphasis on economics on this trip. I was struck by the fact that, and perhaps it's come out today, Victor, I haven't seen it yet, there's still no statement from the SCM. As far as I know, this is the bilateral meeting on defense. And that's because, as I understand it, they wanted to finalize the agreements related to trade and economics and deals, and put it all together in a package. And if you look at the fact sheets, the fact sheets that came out of the visit to Japan, also heavily business deal oriented. The president's rhetoric on commitments to the region was quite strong. Continuing to portray Japan, in the Japan case, model ally, will be there for Japan. Anything you need, at one point he said in front of the cameras, the speech in Yokosuka, all that hit the right notes, I think. But the concrete things that came out of the visits were very economics and deal oriented. And I think, just to build on Evan's point, certainly in Japan, I spend more time in Japan than in Korea. There's a level of anxiety about American security commitments that I have not heard before in the 25 years that I've been working on this relationship. So I think this visit, sort of in a short-term tactical sense, soothes some of that, but it's still very much under the surface.
All right, outstanding. Chris, let me ask you one follow-up. Because you were a longtime Pentagon official, what about the visit of Secretary Hegseth in and around the region to help, I guess, bolster the security piece on an otherwise very economic and trade-dominated summit and leader-level visit, or swing through the region, rather?
Yeah, Mark, I think that's a really important point, because my view is that dimension to this has been somewhat undercovered. Secretary Hegseth was part of this group. He had his own bilateral in Japan. He conducted the SCM in Korea. He attended the ADMM Plus in Southeast Asia. Did a number of other bilats, and by all accounts, quite warm and quite positive. Again, we haven't seen a lot sort of in the way of statements, public pronouncements on American security commitments, but I do think that was an important part of this. Certainly, the Japanese were quite pleased with the meeting he had with Koizumi. So I agree with the premise, I think, of your question, that part of the trip also helped to address, at least to some degree, the underlying security concerns of our friends.
Right, but nonetheless, they're still extant, right? In other words,
definitely, no question, as I said.
Gotcha. Okay, outstanding. And just one note here: SCM, MCM, those are the two. That's the big Minister of Defense, Secretary of Defense annual meeting that governs the alliance. The MCM's the uniform Joint Chiefs component to it, right? Those are big sort of defense summits. ADM plus is a regional grouping, principally around Southeast Asia, plus some other countries. That's the plus. The only other thing I said is that if we get down to the kid, then we're really into the acronyms. But Chris, last question to you. Did, on the security elements of this visit, was there any new ground broken, or what was the big takeaway, other than perhaps just reassurance and engagement, which is not unimportant, as Evan outlined at the outset?
So maybe the piece I'll focus on really is the Japan component, and I'll let Victor address South Korea. Look, I think a key part of Takaichi's message to the president, and one reason why the trip was successful and avoided thorny issues, is she was able to tell him that Japan is going to accelerate its defense buildup to 2% of GDP, reach that benchmark 2 years earlier than previously planned, and set out a path over the next year of revising early Japan's national security and defense strategies with an eye toward further increases starting in 2027. That's pretty significant. I mean, Japan was already most of the way to 2%. So in a sense, she's getting maybe more credit than she deserves there. But I think nonetheless, a significant step. And she talked about Japan's commitment to investments in long-range strike and space capabilities and cyber and strengthening their own defense industry. So I think one of the stories of this visit also is of the continued emergence of Japan as a major security player. There is meat behind this buildup. There are, of course, some warts and pimples on it. Nothing is perfect, but they've done what they said they were going to do, and they're doing even more quickly than they said they would.
All right, outstanding. Thanks,
Quite
Chris.
the metaphor, Chris.
Want to be vivid here for our audience.
Well, it sounds, you've described what I see in the mirror every day, but I digress. Anyway, all right, outstanding. Victor, over to you. Chris teed you up, obviously, to talk about the South Korea portion. But before we get to that, interested in your comments on the broader brushstrokes of the trip.
So I would not disagree with anything that's been said. I'll just offer different words to say the same thing. I mean, I thought that the trip overall, from like Trump's perspective, was successful in the sense that he was able to demonstrate three qualities that he believes he has, as well as to surprise everybody, shock everybody with some surprises. So I saw it sort of as a three-act play. The first act was Trump the peacemaker, where he was in Southeast Asia, and in addition to the agreements he signed with Malaysia and Thailand, he oversaw this Thailand-Cambodia armistice, which again fits his notion that he's the great peacemaker. The second act was to move to Japan and Korea, where he sees himself as the rainmaker, focusing, on what if you total them together, it's $900 billion of investment that's coming from Japan and Korea to the United States that, conceivably he will have total control over. And then the third act was the Trump, the deal maker, right? And that was the big trumped up meeting with Xi Jinping, to make the big deal, which was not a big deal on trade. It was a deal, right, on trade, but not the big deal on trade. And then the other piece of that, which didn't happen, was the meeting with Kim Jong-un, right? So I thought like there was it was like a three-act. He's all about theater. It was like a three-act play, and he was able to hit all he could on that. The big surprise, of course, I thought, was what came in Korea, which was the announcement that he was gonna help South Korea build nuclear submarines. I think that was kind of the big surprise. The shock value surprised everybody, including everybody back in Washington, D.C., is my understanding. And so to the extent that, I think Evans was right with the initial observation, the focus was largely on trade, not on security. This was sort of one big security surprise that he supplied. The question, I think, is the more academic question, if you will, I think is like, why did the Allies allow things to go this way? Like, why did, as Chris said, Japan rolled out the red carpet. They had been planning for this visit for like 6 months. Like, they rolled out the red carpet, and everybody focused on the things that Trump wanted to focus on, which was on the trade and investment. And I think part of the answer to that is that, as I think Chris said, they're doing all these things to make the relationships look good, but they're clearly very angst-ridden about the long-term future because of Trump's unpredictability. And for that reason, like the America First sort of policies have really sort of displaced, if you will, the custodial burden of alliances onto the ally now. It used to be the United States. We were always responsible for the alliance, right? We were always responsible for it, making sure it like didn't fall apart, trying to appease our ally. And now the roles are kind of reversed. Like, these allies want to make the United States happy, because they don't want to they don't want to have a Zelensky moment with Trump, but also because they're thinking about after Trump, they don't want like a fundamental rupture in the alliance over these next 3 years. So they're kind of doing what he wants to do, right? And to me, the question is, how long will they do that? Like, when will they choose to finally say, we're going to plan B?
Yeah. And let me just add one thing before I get to another question, which is just, Evan, 1 second. Let me just add one thing, which is, I think the geopolitics make it this role reversal easier for the Americans to basically effectuate, because there's now a much more extant threat. Right. And you've mentioned this before, the basically systematic chipping away of market access available to the Koreans and to a lesser extent to the Japanese in China, right, puts an emphasis on the North American market, right, in terms of, and I think that allows that dynamic to take place, at least on a temporary basis. All right, Evan, over to a quick two-finger, because I want to get back to Victor really quickly on
Yeah,
South
no, I
Korea.
wanted to come in because Victor had such an important insight about the shift of the custodial burden. 2 points on that. The first is, I think for allies like Japan, Korea, and Australia, the reality is, and we don't like to talk about this publicly because they're our allies and our friends, but there really is no plan B, right? And the reason why you're seeing such extraordinary accommodation, prostration, lighting up Tokyo Tower in red, white, and blue, these expansive commitments to invest in the United States, none of which any of us know how much is actually new money versus what would have happened anyway, is simply because there is no plan B, right? But that said, that's very unique, I think, to those three countries. And I think analytically, it would be a mistake for all of us to assume that framework applies to other allies in Asia, the Philippines and Thailand, or other security partners in the region. That's why I brought up the Singapore example. So in my limited travels and discussions with policymakers, outside the sort of, let's call them the core allies, I think there's an enormous amount of trepidation both about the economic basis of the relationship with the United States, because the US has been so aggressive and assertive and undermined sort of WTO principles, and the security component to it. So while I think that sort of question about plan B is relevant to three countries, I don't think that's the calculation for the rest of Asia. And I welcome disagreement and subtraction from my colleagues, but I think Asia, because the US presence has been based on this unique combination of alliances and political economic bargains, and because Trump has thrown up in the air the question about the reliability of alliances and our commitment to, a political economic bargain, I think for other countries in Asia than the core three, I think the calculation is actually very, very different. But welcome reactions from colleagues.
No, outstanding. Thank Evan. Good stuff there. And it would kind of, you sharpened my point, which was the geopolitics and the need of the North American market, especially, right? And then you can add like the Chinese competitors against Japanese and Korean companies.
I would just add to that, Mark, that it's not that you're right. The North American market is important, so demand from the US, but it's also capital and technology. And especially when we're talking about technologies that everybody believes will drive innovation, AI and chips being
right.
the obvious example, there's no conversation that doesn't include American companies in that. Over.
Right. No, absolutely. And that capital flows, I just put under that rubric, but fair point. Technology as well. All right. Outstanding. Evan, thanks for the intervention. Victor, back to you. We're starting to run a little short on time, believe it or not. But Victor, South Korea, they were the hosts of APEC. Lee Jae Myung, important meeting with President Trump, important meeting with Xi Jinping. What's and no meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, as you mentioned. Takeaways from all of the activities or proceedings, rather, in and around South Korea.
So, because we're short on time, let me just make a couple of points. The first,
we're okay. We're on 20 minutes, but it just, we're okay. But
okay, all right. All right. So then I have a 7-page speech. I'll start right now. So the first thing is that so if we look at the trip overall, like if we look at this overall trip, if you think about it in retrospect, like the piece that was the most unclear was actually the Korea piece. Right, because we didn't know, I didn't know at least the submarine thing was going to come up, but the trade deal itself was actually a total mess in the run up to the summit, right? They tried to use the summit as an action forcing event to hammer out the details on the trade and investment framework deal, and they were nowhere near close. Bessent even said publicly that it was unlikely to be done before the trip, in time for the trip. And they reached an agreement. Trump, I guess, agreed to what all the details that, Wee Sung Lak and others and everybody, the chief of staff, were shuttling back and forth to try to work out. So that was big and that was important. Like that was a very important thing that happened, and it only happened. We didn't know it was going to happen until they actually got to the Seoul stop, and so that ended up making the meeting between the two success. Then we got this submarine thing, which was completely unexpected. And then the interesting thing to me is when I looked at the Lee Xi Jinping meeting, I think it was fine. I think in many respects it was what you would have expected. But in retrospect, to me, what it looked like was that even this progressive president representing a progressive party were are making decisions that really are tilting, show a strategic tilt much more in the direction of the United States, right? And it wouldn't surprise me if later on we saw China taking actions in response to this nuclear submarine decision. I think it was such a surprise. I don't think Xi Jinping even knew it was coming. I mean, nobody here knew it was coming, so I'm sure nobody over there knew it was coming, and there was no way he could react to it at that particular time. But he already reacted to the shipbuilding partnership, right, by sanctioning 6 U.S. firms. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see something coming down the line on economic coercion by China with regard to South Korea. But you combine that, with what I believe, and CSIS has been covering this, what I believe is sort of this creeping militarization of the Yellow Sea now, with the with the aquatic structures and the dozen buoys in the area. And we've tracked the altercations between the Korean survey vessels and the Chinese Coast Guard. You combine that with this decision on nuclear submarines, the shipbuilding agreement, the $350 billion investment agreement that's now done. I mean, there's clearly a tilt here. And then if you look at Hegseth's, even though I haven't seen the document that's supposed to be coming after the SCM yet, but if you look at the press conference and the conversation during the press conference, all good stuff, talking about strategic flexibility, right, improvement of capabilities. They're packaging all these things as part of a bigger alliance modernization package, which will make any changes on the ground in terms of force posture look not like abandonment, but part of modernization. So, so you got to give them credit for getting those pieces right. We'll have to see in terms of the execution, but it kind of is all set up pretty well right now.
It's pretty interesting. The other thing I'll say about the Chinese reaction is a tilt from a progressive government in South Korea. Right. Exactly. That's what's interesting there. So it's not baked in. The other thing, can I just ask you one follow-up question on the submarines? What do you think is behind it? Because you've got, there's always been talk by the Korean Navy about submarines. I remember going to a conference in Busan about 5 years ago that focused on building a single nuclear submarine. It's also, you get into kind of territory on the 123 agreement, right? And here we go with the civilian enrichment capability and all of that, right? What do you think's going on here, Victor?
Yeah, so I don't know. Like again, it was a complete surprise. The only thing I could surmise is that on the Korean side, that if they were going to really swallow this $350 billion commitment, which was, as you know, Mark, like really difficult for them, very hard for them to do, even though they initially agreed to it. They decided to ask for something big, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah. And I think that this is what they asked for. So.
All right, good stuff there.
To say it's all going to be built in Philadelphia, like that would make Trump happy. So whether it's actually going to be built in Philadelphia, we don't know. But to say it's going to be built in Philadelphia, I think that was what made Trump happy too. So.
All right, outstanding. Thanks, Victor.
So are we calling it SCAUCUS now? Is that the relevant acronym?
Well, there was an interesting piece. I think the Lowy Institute put it out that was like sort of talking about how the South Koreans in one fell swoop are like miles ahead of where AUKUS is, because they've already been promised like the the propulsion technology. We don't know what the deal is on nuclear fuel yet. Like we don't know what the deal is yet. But is it going to be compartmentalized, or are they going to actually, allow the South Koreans to produce the fuel? So
I also wonder just on this whether there's some interaction with what's happening in Japan. I mean, because one of the things that Takaichi has said is that Japan's going to build its own nuclear submarines. And of course, it does have the reprocessing capabilities today. So there may be some sort of effort to sort of demonstrate that both, the South Korea is moving down the same path as well. Although
Chris,
the same questions apply about Japan's actual ability to do this and on what timeline.
and
right,
all of this just shows a total failure of China's policies in the region. I mean, it's just amazing to me. But anyway, sorry.
Not at all. This is outstanding discussion. And Chris, to your point, it's why I asked Victor the question about the motivations and the 1-2-3 agreement and the reprise. So we're into this very interesting space about Korea, Japan, possibly parity and all of that, number one. And number two, I think I've heard some talk in town about AUKUS and had a critique that maybe the South Koreans and Japanese should have been in the deal originally, right? Or was there a way to expand this? So this is pretty interesting stuff, I think, that we've almost backed into, right? So, all right, let's get to you, Chris, on the Japanese, the Prime Minister visit. We've got a summit there, got golf clubs exchanged. Victor usually brings a golden crown to my house when he comes over, but I digress there. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just want to come back for a second on this point that Evan made about no plan B, and that's the reality that confronts at least our Northeast Asian allies, and that helps to explain at least some of their behavior. I certainly agree with that. And that distinguishes, of course, these allies from those in Europe who have a multilateral structure in NATO to fall back on, and our allies in Northeast Asia do not. I do think, though, that part of what's going on behind the scenes and under the surface in Tokyo is an effort to think about what Plan B looks like. So in the near term, there is a fierce desire to hold on and preserve stability in the bilateral alliance. No question about that, and we saw that on display. But at the same time, I mean, clearly what's motivating this decision to launch a new defense plan in Japan is strengthen their own defense industry, develop more indigenous capabilities, including longer range, potentially offensive ones. Diversify security partnerships. I mean, none of the other relationships Japan has in the region and beyond come close to the U.S. alliance, but there are some things interesting happening in Japan, Australia, and between Japan and some European counterparts. I had a very interesting discussion with a senior Ministry of Defense official just last week, and I asked him, what are your priorities as you think about, because he's just sort of embarking in this new role. And ordinarily, the first thing out of a Ministry of Defense official's mouth is, we're going to do this, this, and this in the U.S.-Japan alliance and strengthen our cooperation. The first thing he said was strengthening ties with other like-minded partners. So this idea of diversification of ties, boy, there's a long way to go, and that's a steep mountain, but it is clearly a more explicit objective. And I think it reflects this grasping for what Plan B might look like.
Yeah,
I think the Japan-Korea relationship is potentially a part of that as well. And we can talk about that if you like.
No, you just get into this interesting conversation that Evan touched on, and I'm going to oversimplify it, the kind of the bandwagoning balance kind of conversation, right, that political scientists are starting to talk a little bit about in Asia. All right, so then, Chris, excellent comment there. The summit, the Prime Minister, the President, all that good stuff there.
Yes. As I said, I think a very positive overall visit. I mean, maybe the other thing I would just note is the other diplomacy that was happening around the president's trip. I thought that Prime Minister Takaichi's meeting with President Lee it appeared quite warm and quite positive, right? I mean, sounds like it was a 45-minute meeting. It was supposed to be only 20, if you believe what both sides put out. And so I think these early concerns, and Victor, you had a great podcast on this not long ago. The early signs are that Japan-Korea relations are moving forward and sustaining the momentum that was built under Yoon and Ishiba and Kishida, right? So I think that also reflects, I think, some of this uncertainty, right? I go back to Victor's great book on sort of the dynamics among the trilateral relationship. I think some positive developments there. The other thing I would just note, Takaichi also had a meeting with Xi Jinping, which struck me as notably cold. That there's a photo, there's statements that both sides put out. The content is notably cold, and clearly, I think, was signaling a step back on the Chinese side from where they were with Ishiba. I think they view her with much more wariness, and I think that meeting served as something of a shot across the bow. So how she manages the relationship with China is going to be quite interesting to watch.
Chris, can I ask you a question? Because the meeting between the Japanese and South Korean leaders was between a new conservative Japanese leader and a new progressive South Korean leader, right? So historically speaking, that dynamic is not sort of a stable, sustainable one. So how do you and Victor think about the future? Because I fully agree with your excellent assessment of that meeting, but of course, a meeting does not a relationship make, right? And do you see, when you look at the broader political and economic forces between Japan and Korea and the geopolitics, what would be your best guess at this?
Great questions, Evan, and I welcome Victor's views on this as well. I'm cautiously optimistic here. I think Takaichi has come into office demonstrating a commitment to pragmatism. She's been pretty restrained. She emphasized the importance of the relationship with South Korea in her speech to the Diet. Wee Sung-lak visited sort of immediately after she was inaugurated, had a round of meetings with her aides. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that the thing that's going to test both is that there are going to be incidents that either side can choose to make into political cash, right? I mean, there was one just the last couple of days where there was a plan for the Japanese military to refuel a South Korean aircraft. And that plan, which would have been pretty, I think, significant in terms of a step forward in providing logistical support to each other, Japanese canceled it because in their judgment, the plane had flown too close to Tokto. These kinds of things, textbooks, they're going to keep recurring. And so the commitment on both sides to restraint and consideration of the other side will be tested. I do think they have geopolitical reasons to be cooperative in the current moment. And a lot of that is rooted in their shared uncertainty about Trump. So I guess that's how I see it. Victor, I really would be interested in your thoughts.
So I don't disagree with that at all. I particularly footstop your last point, which is, an even more exaggerated argument would be that it really doesn't matter who the leaders are, because they are in such a situation of security scarcity and uncertainty right now between China, Russia, North Korea, and the United States, and the weaponization of trade and investment, that they really have no choice but to work with each other. But the one caveat I would add, Mark, from a domestic perspective, as you know well, is that this is a progressive government in Korea, and this progressive government has a moderate faction and they have a hardcore progressive faction. And so, in part, the moderates have been able to prevail because they've been successful in the summit meetings and the agreements with Trump. If they experience policy failures, particularly with regard to the United States, which is the most important partner, if they experience policy failures, that's going to have an internal domestic effect where these hardline progressive core will really start to come after the moderates, and they could sway Korea policy. Or, like you said, it could be something on Japan, right, where the moderates are going to have to beat back the progressives. So there's a domestic political component to that, despite my starting out with sort of the structural explanation that I think matters greatly. I mean, Mark's very familiar with this too. So
Yeah, and maybe just make one quick comment. It's or just 2 points. First, I would even go further back in that the warming trajectory between the two, all the way back to Imam Bak, right? You know,
yeah.
he tried the Jasomia. So I think the arc is generally moving in one direction. I think when you had this lull, was exactly when, you know, there was a more ideological left-wing faction in the early Moon days. But by the time Moon left, he had endorsed the Comfort Women Agreement and
Right,
didn't touch the
right.
Jasomia, which was very interesting, right?
Yeah.
And the final point I'll say on that, what I think the two things that are working here also that we didn't mention is, one, popular support in South Korea has crept up, right, for this, right, especially among the young generation. That's not insignificant. So you're not going against the grain. And this time around, I would give the Trump administration credit in that they, in the early Moon days, I think they did not really appreciate the U.S. role in keeping these two together in terms of talking. And Chris was in the government then, and I think remembers well that there was the U.S. backed down. There was a vacuum. It took until the Jasomia was threatened for the U.S. to really come back in. And they've never really, the U.S. has never really vacated that position of, I guess you'd say, close and continuing contact. And the Trump 2.0 team has been, I think, very methodical about working this trilateral piece. And I think they get credit there for that as well. All right, sorry, I bored everybody to death with that. Sorry, Evan, quickly, Xi Jinping summit. We're running out of time. We got a little off track. I lost control, but if you could just give us a little bit on Xi Jinping, and then we'll close with some quick comments here.
Okay, thanks, Mark. First and foremost, I want to know where I can get one of these snappy CSIS down vests that
like
Victor's
this?
wearing. Is that the Korean Peninsula
It's
on
the
it,
Korean
Victor?
Peninsula.
Yeah, it's a Korean Peninsula. Mark has one, and I just want Chris to see that we also have Tokdo here. So
Never miss a chance, Victor. That's great.
Okay, I guess at Georgetown, Victor, we're going to have to think about gearing up for the holidays.
get some merch. Yeah, get some merch.
Exactly. We need some Asian studies merch at Georgetown. Okay, U.S. China. Well, look, pretty basic, pretty straightforward. The outcomes of the meeting were very limited and very tactical. It was basically about de-escalating the tensions in the economic relationship. It didn't touch or solve any of the broader structural challenges at all. Number two, the outcomes gave both sides a few minor headline wins. So Trump gets a big ag buy that helps him in the Midwest. He gets to say China is controlling fentanyl. Xi Jinping, for his part, gets a 10% reduction in tariffs, which interestingly matters to China more than people think, because small and medium enterprises in China actually have who need to export to the U.S. market face some headwinds with tariffs. So the tariff reduction for China actually matters. So tactical limited wins for both sides, combined with the fact that both sides essentially preserve their leverage. So the U.S. paused its September 29th export control action, the affiliates rule, which was effectively the expansion of the entities list from covering 5,000 entities to 20,000 PRC-linked entities, and the Chinese, in return, suspended their October 9th deal. So both sides suspended it, but they essentially preserved their leverage. Point number three, there are huge ambiguities that remain in all of this. So the White House on Saturday released a fact sheet. There are all sorts of details in that fact sheet about what China committed to in terms of allowing exports of rare earths that the Chinese have never mentioned, right? So it's not really clear whether or not we got the scope of those commitments that we actually wanted. And then there's the question of future action. There are 232 and 301 trade actions that still could be taken against China. The administration is not really clear whether or not those are off the table. Final point here is probably the biggest or the most significant dimension of this visit was that it opened the door to a 12-month sequence of high-level diplomacy, which the Chinese love, right? This is straight out of the Chinese playbook. that the U.S.-China relationship is best managed leader to leader, and it's best managed by doing commercial deals, right? And so what the Trump-Xi meeting did was it opened the door to Trump going to China in April of next year, Xi Jinping reciprocating, and the Chinese will use that period not just to play for time, but to pull Trump closer, to do lots of economic deals, and at a minimum to avoid further provocations from the Americans, trade actions, export control actions, to bring about relative stability. Final point is that there are huge risks inherent in where we are in the U.S.-China relationship. On the U.S. side, there's a risk of what I like to call snapback. Trump gets bored, Trump gets distracted, Trump gets frustrated, or the fact that Trump's approach to China is too engagement and accommodationist oriented, and you have views from the right and left that just sort of say this is not sustainable. We have to get back to strategic competition. The risk on the Chinese side is overconfidence and overreach. Over to you, Mark.
All right, outstanding. Victor, get that man a vest. All right, well done, Evan. All right, with that, Evan, thanks so much for your this great intervention to take us home. Chris, final thoughts to you and Victor, 15 seconds or so.
Yeah, okay, great. Again, I think successful visit, great optics. I think the question is what comes next in the U.S.-Japan alliance. The seeds of friction are pretty deeply planted. Friction over host nation support, a negotiation coming next year, a friction over the MOU on investment and the implementation of that. Question is whether this Trump visit now opens up space for a more comprehensive and healthy alliance dialogue, 2+2s and so on, that have not yet happened. So my hope is that the machinery of the relationship can now kick in a way that it so far hasn't, but we'll see.
All right, outstanding. Victor, last word to you.
So I'll finish by saying that it's all gone well. It's all gone well thus far, but we have spring of 2026 to worry about, because Trump will probably go to Beijing, and he's probably going to do a North Korea meeting at that point. And then who knows what the Chinese are going to ask Trump on, not just on,
Taiwan
commercial issues, but on Taiwan, right? And who knows what Kim's going to ask Trump with regard to the Korean Peninsula. And that's when all of this positive energy could come to a grinding halt. So we could be in for big surprises in the winter, spring of 2026.
All right, outstanding. Lots to look forward to. Evan, Chris, Victor, thank you. Outstanding episode. I'm just going to add one last thing, and congratulations to the LG Twins for winning the KBO series, even though they're Doosan's sole rival. And congratulations for Hanwha, a long-suffering squad that finished runner-up this year. So hope springs eternal. If Hanwha and LG are winning the KBO series, it's very
what about the Dodgers? You're not going to say anything about the Dodgers?
I'm just it's kind of was rooting for Toronto, but anyway, because the Reds were out of the playoffs within hours, so I didn't really have anywhere to go. So all right, outstanding. Thanks everybody. Thanks again. See you everybody.
All right,
Bye.
see you.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.